Well, this is where I'm going to be. Yeah. All right. Go ahead. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Levinson, the director of the OU Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. And I want to welcome you, both those of you who are here on the beautiful ninth floor of Gale Hall Tower. And I'm not being facetious, it's actually quite a nice spot. And those of you who are online, you're very welcome. Always welcome. All of our activities, all of our lectures, all of our programs are and remain free and very open to the public. I'm glad to see people brought some lunch. You didn't bring some lunch, well, have a lot of rugula and coffee, and that should hold you over. I understand these are tense times for a lot of us. Libenu b'mizrach, as somebody sort of said about a millennium ago. But even though what we may be thinking about is in the East, we're here, Norman, Oklahoma, and happy to be here. And it's a great privilege today to welcome a colleague from a few hours south, Dallas, Texas. We told Reid that we aren't so far removed from things that we don't know where Dallas is. But that's very good. I just want to let you know that next month, thank you, gentlemen. And next month we're going to be hosting for our Just Lunch event, Dr. Janet Ward, member of the history department at OU. She's going to be speaking on the public history of eugenics, which is certainly a topic that a lot of us are very interested in. And in the spring, we have so many events and speakers that I will not even attempt to remember them, because I'll do a bad job. So let me take a minute to introduce today's speaker. Reid Heller is an independent and prolific researcher in Jewish texts and history with a focus on political philosophy. He's written, lectured, and created seminars for decades in the areas of Jewish conversal history, modern Jewish poetry, and Jewish thought. He has gradually laid aside professional obligations to devote himself full-time to studying Andalusian Jewish philosophy from the 10th to the 15th centuries. So we're happy to see some of our Spanish students here today in person. Welcome, and you're always welcome back, even if it's not Andalus that we're talking about. Reid has lived and practiced commercial law in Dallas, Texas for more than 4 decades. He and his wife, Karen, hired geneticists. So I think once you're a geneticist, I think you're always a geneticist. Pretty sure of that. A flamenco dancer, and according to Reid, the world's greatest grandmother, although I'm sure there are many others who make that claim. They have 2 married daughters and 6 grandchildren, and we are extremely happy to welcome Reid Heller today to speak. Let me get the title properly. Chanukah, Advent, and Other Visitors to the Tabernacle. Our Ushpiz of today, Mr. Reid Heller.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Alan, and thank you, Louise, for your confidence that I would be an appropriate speaker for an audience like this. And with that, let me introduce a talk which I have a luxurious amount of time, almost 40 minutes, to share with you. My interest in this field is broad-based. It's not, I'm not simply going to recite information, historical, chronological material. I'm interested in religious phenomena and the peculiar means by which what we would call religious experience, some people might call it religious myth and ritual, are expressed and often misexpressed in attempts to reconstruct them. The focus of today's talk is two rituals that I doubt if you search literature you'll ever find them mentioned together. One is Las Posadas, which is the Advent ritual that's identified with the city of Avila in central Spain, now probably forgotten there, but made its way across the Atlantic and wound up in northern Mexico, in Mexico City. It is now the largest Advent type ritual associated with Latin America. The other ritual that interests me in connection with Las Posadas is the Jewish ritual known as Seder Ushpizin, which is found in the Zohar. It's based on, and I'll mention the verses in the Zohar on which it's based, but it was innovated by Isaac Luria, and it was transmitted to the world through Luria's disciples and eventually codified in a collection of Jewish rituals associated with Isaac Luria called Chemdat Yamim. Chemdat Yamim is a source for almost everything we can think of as Lurianic type rituals adorning Shabbat, Yom Tovs, and also things, also lesser known, what we consider lesser known holidays, but with mystical orientations associated with the 1st, 2nd century life in Palestine. So with that brief introduction, I will let me add one more thing. The problem I'll be dealing with is a very contemporary problem. We think of it in psychological or psychohistorical or sociological terms as discontinuity, broken connections. And among the writers or the people reflecting on this problem in a big historical context, who've influenced my way of thinking for many years, is Robert Lifton, who Robert Lifton has devoted himself to the problem of the fractured self and to discontinuity in imagination and the fractured possibilities of symbolic immortality as a way to create both community and also national life and create horizons, both past and future, that inspire sense of responsibility for the present, commitments to the future. This kind of brokenness that constitutes modernity has a remarkable resonance in the experience of the 16th century, specifically, from my perspective, in those Jews who underwent a forcible conversion in Portugal in 1497. I have done work with and read papers before at the Society for Crypto-Jewish Studies, and I'm very interested in them. My particular interest is in the Portuguese experience because it is that community that I'll speak about in a moment, that for many years, 30 years almost, was sort of tolerated under a don't ask, don't tell type of regimen in which they were permitted in their private life to retain some aspects of Jewish tradition, or at least a sense of continuity with the Jewish past, as long as no one knew that they weren't secretly continuing their Jewish practices. This kind of split self and the kinds of discontinuity that flowed out of there have some very interesting resonance with contemporary experience of alienation from tradition and from traditional ways of thinking. I'm going to try and reconstruct it in this paper in the example of the problem that in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish halacha is called karet, the problem being cut off. Okay. So today I'll be sharing some research on the origins of two new Christian rituals, Jewish and Catholic, arising almost simultaneously at the end of the 16th century in response to peculiar historical challenges, one in northern Israel, in the town of Sfat, and the other along the Rio Grande. In order to make sense of the rituals, I'll begin with a few words about the historical crisis confronted by new Christians in the course of the 16th century and two very different communities that innovated rituals to restore communal confidence and continuity with their past. Of course, they had to use very different means to do it since they were in entirely different religious contexts. Converso is the Spanish term for one who converted to Christianity from Islam or Judaism. The English equivalent is convert, and the Latin root suggests the extremity of the converso situation. The Oxford English Dictionary defines convert as one who turns, as in the opposite direction, 180 degrees, or changes into or transforms oneself. Once transformed, the converso becomes something new. A corollary of a radical transformation is to be unrecognizable to those who knew one before the transformation. In this talk, I'm going to address the problem of recognition with particular attention to the ancient ancestors. When I speak of the converso crisis, I refer to the crisis of the inner life of a specific group, the Portuguese conversos. The traumatic circumstances surrounding their conversion produced a subgroup within the Jewish people at large, one distinguished by inner exile, a shattered connection to the Jewish past, and a psychology permeated by exile and sin, initiating a relentless search for symbols and rituals of atonement using the language of exile, homeland, return, all of which, as we shall see, are based on a longing for ancestral recognition. Although there are at least three important dates associated with mass conversion of Iberian Jews, the Sevilla and trans-Iberian pogroms of 1391, the expulsion of 1492, and the Portuguese forced conversion of 1497, today I focus exclusively on the latter. Circa May 1497, when the Jewish community of Lisbon, Portugal, was forcibly converted on a single day, followed by the kingdom's remaining Jews by the end of the summer. How, one might ask, does any human being, and in our case a forcible convert, address the pain of an inner life so radically estranged from traditional moorings? How can the convert restore even a tenuous connection with the ancestral way of life that was integral to a sense of continuity between past and future, not to mention longings for symbolic immortality? You know, these I'm pushing these back to the 16th century, but for those of you who, have like to immerse yourselves from time to time in a good Maskil memoir, or someone who grew up in a highly religious environment and then finds themselves either drawn to or immersed in an entirely modern context without the kind of privilege given to religious particularism or something like that, you also see echoes of the problem of the 16th century. But the 16th century is a great place to begin because we have an entire society, in this case, the entire community of Portugal, transformed into a situation of religious ambiguity that opens up enormous areas for, let's call it creativity, self-fashioning, and new ways of looking at the world. And we don't have to look any further than the greatest thinkers and descendants of that community, typified by someone like Baruch Spinoza, to understand how powerful that shattering was. For most of us, the crisis of Iberian Jewry is linked to their expulsion on Tisha B'Av in the summer of 1492, but the expulsion had the counterintuitive effect of intensifying the orientation of some elements of Spanish Jewry. For those who preferred exile to conversion, a dangerous sea voyage was not the only means of escape. Nearby Portugal opened its doors and for an exorbitant fee granted shelter to as much as 1/3 or more of Spain's Jewish refugees. For those who did not have the money, by the way, there were some really terrible things in store for them. In some cases, their children would be taken away by the Portuguese authorities and sent off to the Azores or to nearby islands off the coast of Africa, described in Sfardí lore as the islands of lizards, meaning unclean things, shachats. So there were also people that could not make it, and so what they wound up doing is resettling in Extremadura near the borders of Portugal, retaining their relationship with the Portuguese family that had more money maybe and could get permanent residence in Portugal, and in some cases, I would say retaining the most elements of Jewish life of any of those who remained in Spain. Extremadura is also very important to our region down into northern Mexico, because this is the place where the Virgin, the Black Virgin, was sacred, and she was transported from there to Monterrey. Monterrey is the center of the cult of the Virgin in Mexico. For most of us, the crisis of Iberia, for those who stayed behind, the larger problem was social acceptance in their new identity, and specifically the challenges posed by the limpieza de sangre, the purity legislation. Limpieza statutes racially stigmatized those with known Jewish ancestry, barring them from certain occupations and public honors. They were classified as nuevos cristianos, in contrast to those of old Christian stock. The limpieza legislation left the conversos of 1492 suspended between religious assimilation and permanent racial stigma. Also, experiences that are not unknown in 19th and 20th century modernity. Many of them responded to the stigma by acquiring new names and false ancestries, deepening their alienation from their ancestors and ancestral ways. In the confusion of the mid-16th to 17th centuries, most of conversos of 1492 successfully did acquire new identities, assimilated and abandoned even their memories of the past. This is what has created a lot of both confusion and controversy among those who claim to have Jewish ancestry of a Hispanic background. I'd like to point out that I'm not weighing in on that, but I have a particular focus on the Portuguese community because it immersed itself in Christianity in a single day. An entire community, defined community, was transformed from Jewish to Christian in Lisbon, and then over the next few months, the remaining population of Portugal was forcibly converted after them. So there was never a sense of an individual choice. There was no way to run away. There were no ships permitting them to exit and preserve their identity, their Jewish connections. They were simply trapped, and so the experience was something more like a divine command. I mean, you see, and this becomes a big motif for hundreds of years, including in the messianic career of Sabbatai Tzvi and his followers, who came to idealize or theologize mass conversion, and in fact reenacted it in imitation of Sabbatai when he was told by the Ottoman Sultan that he would need to convert. For those who left Spain, the choice of exile in Portugal, demonstrating their uncompromising vital connection to Jewish life and sufficient material resources necessary to sustain them in the land of their exile. Their willingness to accept exile in Portugal is actually the best evidence of their Jewish commitments, not to mention their relative wealth. For the Jews in exile, Judaism was a vital, non-negotiable component of their dignity and self-awareness. All this is to say that those Spanish Jews who in 1492 made their way across the border to Portugal or stayed close to Portugal there in Extremadura in order to enjoy a connection they thought to Judaism are those most likely to have had strong religious commitments, as well as larger than normal personal resources sufficient to ensure the continuity of that commitment. It is precisely this concentration of Jews, the best educated and most committed Jewish population in Europe, who made their way to Portugal in the summer of 1492. They were the Jews least likely to assimilate, the most willing to endure hardship, and it is precisely these Jews who were dragged by armed Portuguese constables to chapels throughout Lisbon and forcibly, often violently baptized in late April, early May 1497. I mean, it is a fascinating and unfortunately under-described phenomenon. We find more material even now written or available about the Spanish experience of 1492, but the world and Jewish scholarship, of course, was deeply enriched by the work of Khan Yerushalmi, who is the leading expert, who was the leading expert and researcher on the Jews of Portugal, through his death and through his chair at Columbia, produced an enormous number of scholars who are doing fantastic work on Portugal and other aspects of the Iberian Converso past. The peculiar qualities of the Spanish refugees that inspired Portugal's King Manuel to take the controversial step of forced conversion rather than risk losing an irreplaceable source of professional expertise, economic creativity, and wealth. These were under the laws of Renaissance Europe, the king's personal property. To soften the blow of this extraordinary insult to Portuguese Jewish dignity, King Manuel agreed for a period of decades not to inquire into the Portuguese conversos' religious behavior, a policy that I mentioned earlier we express as don't ask, don't tell. This 30-year period enabled Jews to practice and to some degree habituate to a life of leading a double truth. Outward expressions of Christian conformity or Catholic conformity, inward clinging on to the past and to a certain small area of spiritual integrity. Beginning on that strange day in May 1497, we conclude with one of the most bizarre moments in European Jewish experience, a day in which a remarkable Jewish community goes to bed as Jews and the next day finds itself transformed into a Catholic community. It's important to see it not just as a personal, but as a public, communal, and ultimately political act. And that political act left its impression on the way that Jews of this background come to see themselves. Initially, they remained in the same houses with little else changed. Their old institutions and way of life went underground. And in this strange metamorphosis, we begin our exploration of the world of the Portuguese crypto-Jews. Unlike their descendants, for centuries to come, Portuguese New Christians had no need to conceal their Jewish origins from neighbors. They remained in their centuries-old large coherent communities among neighbors who knew them to be Jews, now masquerading as Christians, with a little sense of Christian commitment or understanding, at least in the generation that was forcibly converted. In that sense, the situation of Portuguese New Christians cannot be more different than those of Spanish Jews who remained at home. Although the trauma of 1492 created a collective memory for the Jews of Spain, it was the trauma of 1497 that created a new Jewish national identity within a formerly Jewish community that was no longer nominally Jewish. The descendants of 1497 would henceforth refer to themselves as La Nación. The fact that they actually gave a name to their community like this suggests the depth and profundity of the psychological and political. And that becomes, for me, the overriding theme to address when we're talking about the problem of kare, meaning cutting off, because cutting off also stimulates the desire to reattach. So in this case, we're going to be looking at rituals of reattachment that have both psychic value and also political communal significance. Over the next 4 decades, the Portuguese New Christians developed one of the greatest financial networks in Europe, with trading agents in London, Antwerp, Paris, Rome, Ferrara, Ancona, and Venice, among many others. In an era when the Portuguese wealth flowed out of Africa in the Far East, Portuguese New Christians forged new trade routes, bypassing the Silk Road and its Muslim rulers who had dominated the Far Eastern trade for 700 years. Small luxury goods, light and easily transported, especially spices, silks, gems, were a specialty. Simultaneously, they engaged in diplomacy at the highest levels in all the great kingdoms of Europe, including the papal court, bribing and delaying the onset of a Portuguese Inquisition for more than 30 years, extending credits to warring kings, and ultimately using their wealth to punish oppressors of new Christians. And that raises the story of the House of Mendes, Dona Gracia, etc. In 1537, after the wealthy converso merchant bankers, the House of Mendes, had exhausted their power and wealth, delaying a Portuguese Inquisition, the young Dona Gracia Mendes embarked on Protestant London in a dazzling career that eventually would take her to Ferrara, Italy, and the court of Solomon the Magnificent. Her departure from Portugal marks the end of the relative safety of the Portuguese New Christians, La Nación, and the new Inquisition, and the next phase of Portuguese history was characterized by the severities of the Portuguese Inquisition and a terror that reduced the once proud Portuguese New Christians to hundreds of years of fear and double lives. Some of the former Jews pursued opportunities abroad, including African slaving, ivory importation, others in the Far East pursuing the spice trade, still others as conquistadors in the Brazilian wilderness, carving plantations and new modes of life in remote ports and jungles. But regardless of how we view these things from our vantage point in the 21st century, there were different ways of weighing moral opportunities, and of course, to talk about the 16th century without privileging colonial type exploits is almost impossible, with very few exceptions. It was the focus for advancement and for those struggling people in the middle class looking to ennoble themselves or improve their life circumstance. By the middle of the 16th century, some Portuguese New Christians noted the relative quiet of the Spanish Inquisition in contrast to their own increasingly active Portuguese Inquisition, and claimed the right of return as descendants of former residents of Spain. Their immigration also created opportunities for refashioning identity and adoption of new Spanish names and biographies, not to mention falsified genealogies to erase their Jewish past. The Spanish immigration continued for decades. I'm talking about from Portugal. And by the 1580s, 4 generations after 1497, when Spain and Portugal were united under Philip II, Spain acquired a Jewish problem again. The Portuguese New Christians returning to Spain had reintroduced crypto-Judaism, something that had virtually ceased to exist among those Jews who had remained in Spain and more or less accommodated themselves to the situation. And by the way, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the son of one of the great polemicists and historians of the Spanish New Christians, who in the wake of 1391 converted to Christianity, and in the wake of 1492 converted to Christianity, arguing that they all would have completely disappeared if it had not been for the Limpieza de Sangre legislation, continuing oppression, and their marginalization in society. In this period, the word Portuguese became synonymous with Judeo, Jew. And when speaking of Spanish crypto-Jews after the mid-16th century, I mean those Portuguese New Christians who returned to Spain from Portugal, bring with them the unique identity born of the Portuguese trauma. For these people, the term Spanish Portuguese does not refer to two communities. Rather, it refers to a fusion of two cultures living in Portugal, both of which experienced the trauma of 1497. This is the community for whom the break with Judaism proved to be the slowest, most painful, and were most in need of rituals of expiation, reassurance, and reconnection. And with this in mind, we now turn to the fate of two very different Portuguese New Christian communities and the rituals they innovated to respond to their respective situations. Two Portuguese communities, two rituals, one nation. The Portuguese and New Christians who made their way to the Ottoman Empire, particularly the land of Israel, by the 2nd century, what we call the land of Israel today, by the second half of the 16th century, the Portuguese New Christians' search for security had taken them far beyond Spain into many of the farthest corners of the earth: Brazil, Africa, India, Indonesia, Philippines, China, Korea, and Japan. Those who had returned to Spain had opened to them all of the Spanish New World, following the example of their symbolic leaders in exile, Doña Gracia Mendez and her nephew, Joseph Hanasi, looking east to Turkish dominions and ultimately to the land of Israel. In pursuit of a homeland for New Christians, the Doña Gracia and her nephew, Don Joseph, they purchased the right from the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman, to rebuild the walls of the ancient city of Tiberias. According to Maimonides, by the way, this is in Mishnah Torah, it's the city from which Jewish rule would return to the Jewish people because it was the last to lose Jewish sovereignty. Doña Gracia and Don Joseph subsidized a woolen silk manufacturing center and booked passage to Ottoman Turkey for the persecuted Spanish-Portuguese Jews trapped there in the Papal States. Only a small percentage of whom completed the journey to Tiberias. Now, Tiberias is a city located on the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. It's in the northern part of Israel. It's an ancient city. The name suggests the emperor it was named after. So it's not a place of enormous historical, it's from the era of the Roman period, but it has a certain associations up there because the Galilee was the place from which Jewish rebellion stemmed. The Jewish rebellion, the first Jewish rebellion of the year 66. and many of its leaders, and those and their descendants, and many of the rabbis that we know best from the Mishnah and later Talmudic memories. This is the place, the rough area in which their lives played out, because we have to remember that the city of Jerusalem and the areas of Judea itself were basically off limits after the year 70 and the first Roman conquest. But by the time of the second rebellion, and the year 131, and 132, all of the South was completely foreboded. And really, Jews could never enter Jerusalem until a decree by Constantine in the 4th century that permitted them once a year on Tisha B'Av to walk through the streets of Jerusalem and visit the ruins of the destroyed temple. So let's now turn to the ancestor ritual of the land of Israel. We call it Seder Ushpizin. It's celebrated. How am I doing for time, by the way?
About 10 minutes. Thanks.
For goodness sakes. Okay. The ancestor recognition ritual of the land of Israel, Seder Ushpizin, is something that occurs or is found, as I mentioned earlier, in the Chamdat Yamim, this 17th and 18th century compilation of Lurianic rituals. So I'm going to skip over some sections about people who encourage Isaac Luria about his career to get directly into this ritual associated with Sukkot. Each night of Sukkot, ancestors are invited to come into the sukkah in order to eat with people, with celebrants of the Sukkot meal. And sections of the Zohar are recited. The words go like this: Ulush Pizin Ilayin Kadishin, enter exalted holy guest, Tivu Tivush Pizin Ilayin, Tivu Tivush Pizin Kadishin, Tivu Tivush Pizin de Himnetu, de Dimhemnut, be seated, honored guests, holy faithful. Guests, each evening a new sacred ancestor is announced, and the evening celebration is devoted to the qualities of the Zohar each assigns them. Luria's Seder Ushpizin, established in the 1570s, or celebrated in that era, reveals itself as a powerful embodied therapy for the fragile and guilt-ridden descendants of the Portuguese Jews who had made their way to the city of Spat, a town farther north of Tiberias, that had become the center for religious revival and religious methods of reconstituting the political and spiritual institutions of the Jews in exile. The new Christians had their own parallel ritual in the form of Las Posadas, and this comes about as follows. The city of Avila was a great Jewish town. The city of Avila was also the capital of what we think of as Jewish mysticism in Spain. It was the location at which the Zohar was first published in the year 1290, and the Zohar, being this critical text, and its association with Avila, also left an impression on those Jews and their descendants who remained in that city. And the most important two of which are known as Saint Teresa, who founded a monastic, a female monastic order there, and her disciple, Juan de la Cruz. Thank you, Luis. But yeah, Juan is actually the person who, if you read carefully his biography and compare it to entries on Las Posadas in the Catholic Encyclopedia, you will start to find some things that are not publicly acknowledged. That is, that Juan de la Cruz was actually the person who initiated this, and that Teresa was the one who gave it her blessing. That means that Avila somehow had a recollection of rituals that would allow Jews to reconnect themselves to their past, these former Jews, but do it in a way now that was more appropriate to a Christian world. And what was that way, that method? They would walk during the Advent season, just before, in the days leading up to Christmas, with torchlight parades going from house to house, and they would sometimes stop and celebrate. The later formal versions of it that came to the Latin American world involved actual singing and a long poem. Some of you know the poem, probably know it by heart. The rituals, coincidentally, began in circa 1580, when they crossed the Atlantic. Most people talk about them being established in Indian settlements in and around Mexico City, but in fact they were introduced in the north around the time of the voyage of Luis de Carvajal, the governor of Nuevo León, northern Mexico, who brought with him a very significant settlement of Jews, of new Christian Jews, to create a kind of converso homeland along the Rio Grande and the mountains immediately to the south. So the adaptation of the Avila rites of Juan de la Cruz in the New World, especially in connection with the Carvajal immigration, produced a kind of poetic recreation of an ancestor recognition ritual. So it goes like this. You approach a home, and you, in this poetic song, you say, "Are you Joseph?" The dramatic moment is the census that was required for the people of Israel in the time of Herod. Right? This is something that's discussed in the book of Matthew, and he has to go back from Nazareth to Bethlehem, but nobody recognizes Joseph, right? So he knocks on the door. Are you Joseph? Is your wife Mary? Come in, pilgrims. I did not know you. This is the moment of recognition at the peak of it. After multiple occasions in which Joseph is pleading to be allowed in, to be recognized by the Jews of Bethlehem, he is finally recognized, and they treat him with great dignity. So they mirror the language of the Zohar. Entran santos peregrinos, come in, holy pilgrims, receive this corner, because even though the place is poor, I offer it to you from my heart. Let's sing with joy, everyone at the thought that Jesus, Joseph, and Mary came to honor us today. The recognition is not just personal, it's metaphysical. Instead of celebrants welcoming divine ancestors, this ritual has roles for both the owner celebrant and the divine guests. And the divine guests are not initially recognized. They're repeatedly rejected. And then in a moment of despair for the pilgrims, there is a sudden flash of recognition. They're seen as divine, the tension is broken, and the holy guests are transformed from despised strangers and refugees into the Queen of Heaven, her consort Joseph, and the Godchild. The trauma and dishonor of conversion is replayed in this recognition ceremony as a glorious transformation which the converso participants and spectators see the Holy Family of Christ dismissed then accepted by their ancient kinsmen, at first acting with the same callousness as Christians did to the conversos, then elevated to the heights of Jewish or Christian glory. But in order to avoid offense to Christian sensibilities, Jews rather than Christians are the ones who reject the holy pilgrims. The dishonor of conversion is thus healed, the new Christians accepted, and the stigma of limpieza legislation momentarily forgotten as the despised Jews are honored. The converts' break with the ancestors is thus publicly repaired, and the sacred chain of Jewish ancestry from the line of Abraham and David is restored, but all in a Christian context. The converso becomes both Christian and Jew simultaneously in a new and thoroughly embodied sense, and recognizes worthy of Christian honor, though scarcely anyone but a new Christian would recognize what was really happening under the surface. The Las Posadas ritual accomplishes a metaphysical assimilation of oppositions, Christian Jew, purity, impurity, debased and exalted, saved and damned, that affirms all aspects of the converso's persona and replaces estrangement with thoroughgoing reconciliation of seemingly incompatible religious ancestral identities. Las Posadas also draws on ancient rituals of hospitality in Western classical and biblical world, as well as the motif of the meal with the ancestors, which is identical in terms of what is done in Seder Ushpizin, where the Jews at Sukkot welcome the ancestors to have a meal with them. The two rituals, Seder Ushpizin and Las Posadas, were fashioned at an ominous time for new Christians at the peak of the Counter-Reformation, when the fires of the Inquisition burned with renewed intensity, and the return of Portuguese new Christians to Spain raised fresh suspicions about the converso problem. It was also a time of enormous audacity and hope, when heroic spiritual geniuses on the order of Isaac Luria and Juan de la Cruz were reviving ancient faiths, thus well known to current historians as the series of movements throughout the 16th century to create new Christian kingdoms dominated by Renaissance politicians like Doña Garcia Mendez, her nephew Don Joseph Nasi, immediately thereafter, Luis de Carvajal and his famous nephew, Luis de Carvajal Jr. The psychohistorian Robert Lifton, in his work, The Broken Connection, in his comments on ecstatic conversion, which I would argue, apply equally to traumatic conversion, observed, one never returns to exactly the same inner structure of self following conversion. Having once broken old forms, one senses that one can be broken again, or at least extended beyond early limitations. A personal model is thus constructed for the symbolic reordering necessary to psychological change. The whole sequence can be regularized in cultural ritual. In other words, the trauma that founded La Nacion, those who remained Christian, as well as those who were returning to Judaism, introduced a new kind of interior life distinguished by new vulnerabilities, new energies, new longings, as well as the capacity for inner shattering and reconfigurations in centuries to come. This is what I mean when I talk about the 16th century prefiguring in certain central themes the experience of the modern world. The Portuguese new Christians of the Rio Grande responded to the founding trauma of 1497 so that one can say of those who did not return to Judaism, they were neither Jews nor Christians, or perhaps both, something new, almost modern. They prefigured qualities that today we associate with modernity, stress on the present and future, the emphasis of the past and tradition, and above all, adaptability. This is also addressed in other parts of Lifton's work as the protean man and the protean tendencies of the modern situation. So with that, I think it would be best to open this to questions. And if one of the questions is, how did this paper, Song from a Withered Limb, get its name? Be happy to answer that by citation to the poem. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a couple of questions, so let me open the floor.
I have a great question. Is something that I experienced working here or even in the fundraising department. I worked with a woman named Bernie Rael, and turns out she was born in a city in northwest New Mexico, and the whole city was full of people from Mexico in that northern part. But she told me, I think I had my DNA checked, and it turns out I'm Jewish. She didn't know it. And she said she really wasn't happy about it. So that's my only experience.
Well, the people of northern New Mexico, and I'm talking about Santa Fe and farther north, all the way up to the Colorado, to the end of the Rio Grande, they are largely the remnants of the settlement that left Mexico City after, in 1598, 2 years after the Carvajal Auto de Fe's, Mexico City. Carvajal and all his followers were burned at the stake in 1596, and then in 1598 they put together a illicit government-approved expedition that basically settled northern New Mexico. Actually, all of New Mexico, and that laid the foundation for the northern part of the Converso settlement of the Rio Grande. There is a substantial southern Rio Grande or southeastern Rio Grande settlement, that part that's associated with Texas, all from the Gulf of Mexico to El Paso. The people there, I mean, I've worked down there. I've talked to many families down there. And I can tell you they're all closely connected to the people of Monterrey, the leading families of Monterrey, and these people openly call themselves Judíos. They have no question about who they are. They're just not interested in Judaism. They're very interested in their ancestry, which they treasure in the same way that, Mediterranean people treasure ancestry. They see themselves as superior to others because they have famous biblical ancestors. Okay? Yes.
I wasn't exactly sure when you were describing the situation with the video. Was St. John of the Cross, did he have Jewish ancestors?
Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, he and Saint Teresa and Juan de la Cruz were both grandchildren of people of Jews. And Avila was a definitely famous Jewish town and is most associated with the Zohar. It is the mystical city par excellence of Iberia, at least Christian Iberia. And it coincidentally, the Seder Ushpizin relies explicitly on verses of the Zohar. And the area where Seder Ushpizin was initiated, under Isaac Luria's, in Isaac Luria's era in the 1570s, is Sfat, which has it's in a kind of hilly, semi-mountainous area of northern Israel, comparable in many ways to Avila. And it became kind of a little Avila in exile. Luis.
Just a couple of factual questions. One, I think that the kingdom of that right?
Well, it is so confusing because of the terrible maps that were drawn.
Right.
But, when they express it in leagues, it looks more like, north to San Antonio, Austin. But the square itself and the imprecision of the maps make it look like it could have gone, much further north. But I don't know anybody that, has argued it goes much beyond Austin, San Antonio area. What they do argue is that it goes as far, west as the, to include Acapulco and places like that on the west coast of Mexico. Those areas were never touched by Carvajal and his people. But Nuevo Leon did become, was a thing. It was a silver play, and it's something we don't have time to discuss today, but it is an extraordinarily important site for those who are interested in the subject matter because of the traces of Jewish presence and Jewish consciousness that were retained. And that is largely a function, I argue, of the Portuguese origins of Carvajal and the people that were brought there in 1580.
Well,
Okay.
let me ask everybody to give Reid Heller a big round of applause. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next month when Janet Ward is speaking on the public history of eugenics. So again, thank you very much. Have a good day, and thank you, Reid.
Thank you very much for